Good afternoon. Before all of that, a request to actually give a huge round of applause to the two gentlemen. They have caught the red eye to be here, and despite all the carbon footprint, I think the offset will be by the gyan that we will gather from this session. So, if I can just to speed up the process and to minimize my intervention as an immoderate moderator, may I begin with Sivakumar? As we have often discussed this, Mr. Kumar, this sustainability is most enduring, they say, when it's actually built into the model and not bolted onto a model. From your experience, how have you tried to ensure this, while at the same time also get an internal buy-in, build a bottom-up movement? Very briefly, if you can touch upon this important issue which seems to be bothering many.
Thanks, Kumar, for a very central question to this topic to begin with. Not very different from what you heard right from the very beginning of the conversation this afternoon through the minister and then the subsequent panel. When you say there is no choice, the reason why there is no choice is because, again, to coin the word a little back and forth like it happened in all the sessions, the business of sustainability, when you believe is the very sustainability of business, there is not much of a choice of building it in to everything that you do. It's not anymore bolting on. If there is not enough water and no water after some time, and if air quality that we discussed a little while ago is going to turn poorer, or if climate, what we considered change, is already become a climate emergency, or if inequality is only worsening with all the growth that we are seeing around, and many such other factors, are all going to impact the very sustainability of business going forward. If you build a factory that will last for 40 years, and if there's no water in that vicinity after 10 years, it's not sustainable. And so on and so forth. So therefore, if you are very clear that the business is not going to be sustainable unless you think sustainability and work on it. Now, this is something that as a corporate, we have seen it early on. I mean, you're trained, you talked about bottoms up and how do you really sell in and all of that. Is that the core part of any strategy is how do you really see weak signals and amplify them very early on. Much before all of these have become buzzwords over the last couple of decades. Nearly 30 years ago, ITC had articulated very clearly the various elements that are going to impact the future of society and therefore the business within that society. And therefore, whether it is, if you have to make paperboard, it has to come out of sustainable forests. And that's the reason for that kind of a backward integration work, R&D into right clones and so on. Or if you have to ensure that your brands need to succeed and scale, the farmers must get fairer and living incomes. And that contributed to an e-Chopal initiative. We talked about plastics a little earlier. We have been, as we call, as part of recycling, plastic positive. So I think each of these, when they are integral part of your business, and to make that integral part, you need innovation. How do you ensure that if all of these kind of things have to happen, if the only way to do it is paying something out of your pocket, then it becomes a trade-off. Then should I do this, should I do that, and all of those issues. But if you say the only way the business will prosper is by paying more to the farmer, and the only way the farmer is going to earn more is producing the right quality that our consumers want, is you create that reciprocal dependency. So innovation really is at the core of making this a part of your business models. And so across all the categories, I think that's been the experience that we have. So you need to see early, amplify those signals to start working early. There was another comment a little earlier on in the panel on the ecosystem. So many of these kind of things can't be done alone by individual enterprises, and therefore how do you enable the larger ecosystem to also operate, whether it is the legislation that is required to make some of these kind of things happen, or whether it is consortia of industry making it happen. All of that must also get enabled, and that's also something that individual industries can take on that role and orchestrate.
Very important points, actually. I think that's the problem with being in media, that once answer is given, we get multiple questions in our mind, but then we will keep it for some other day. But the point, like for example, you said about paper boards and sustainable forest. You mentioned about seeing things early and then amplifying it and all. One question at the back of the mind I won't ask now is essentially, when you enter into a new area, how do you then therefore do an impact assessment in terms of sustainability early on before getting into a venture? That's something which may be another issue, maybe for another day, but that's something which lingers after this thing. But I'll come back now to Rajat.
10 seconds since you asked it. I mean, I can't let it also go like a
thank you. Thank you.
A correspondent versus a corporate. There is common practice of double materiality effort that is done as part of any sustainability effort. It's the impact that our operations are going to have on the environment around and society around, and how we are going to get impacted by what is around, is something which is done as a very elaborate exercise. And therefore, there is a structured process of making all of this happen.
Great. Rajat, you've often spoken about decarbonization. Many have been reading you about what you've been saying on that. And when we discussed earlier, you mentioned about building India right. What should be the question therefore is around what should be the immediate priorities. You also talked of that there are opportunities, perhaps some sense in terms of what should be the immediate priorities, the opportunities that you see on the horizon. And linked to that is a question in terms of where, given that there are constraints in terms of funding, resources and all, what should be some areas where there can be a business and government collaboration for some quick wins? If you can touch upon any of these.
There are many questions in your question, so I'm going to pick one maybe. You talked about the topic of decarbonization. In some ways, this is, if you take a bit of a longer term view of life, this is one of probably 2 or 3 largest trends in the world, which obviously then impact industrial and corporate investment. The others are digitization, AI that we see, and maybe there is geopolitics and shift of incomes or increasing incomes in the emerging markets in Asia today and Africa tomorrow, hopefully. So these, if you think about it, these are probably 3 biggest trends that will unlock investment in the world. And let me pick the topic of decarbonization related to today's topic. I think I'd say 3 messages on that from a corporate perspective and a corporate investment perspective, because this is a trend that will absorb trillions of dollars of investment one way or the other, whether we get to the 1.5 degree and stay on that pathway, or we go to a 3.5 degree pathway, right, which is, we're trending towards certainly more than 1.5 at this point of time. I think the 3 more messages here that I'd make is that there's a fair amount of doom and gloom at this point of time relative to 2 or 3 years ago on this topic, and therefore, and since this topic often dominates the conversation around sustainability itself. But research that we've done recently for corporate investment actually shows that investment has been growing by leaps and bounds, and I'll give you some numbers to back that up. Then there are some conditions that are needed for investments to continue to accelerate in the space. So these are 3 big messages on this topic, but let me start with the doom and gloom, right? I think all of us have been reading the wars across the world, increasing energy prices, the inflationary increases that came post-COVID have actually led to a pullback, it seems, on the investment that governments and in some cases corporates have been making, certainly the visible ones. So, for example, you may have read about UK pushing back its EV deadlines or ICE vehicle ban deadlines. Oil majors, Shell and others, changing executives at the top and correspondingly their decarbonization targets. There's conversation around the new administration in the US, and particularly rollback of the IRA, which would have aided investments in the US, and particularly most likely to happen for electric vehicles, the subsidies that would have been provided to the consumer. The bankruptcy of the largest battery player in Europe, largest European battery player in Europe, Northvolt. Many startups, so including companies like RenewCell. Reduced valuations of a company like Ørsted, which was the largest offshore wind player in the world, et cetera, right? So there's a bunch of doom and gloom messages that are coming out. Against this, our research seems to suggest, if we take just a little longer time frame, that corporate investments in this space are expanding, right? So if you look at, we looked at 1,000 corporates, roughly the top 1,000 corporates, wherever information was available. So Chinese information is a little bit patchy, though investments are very large in China. Within that, we looked at 300-400 corporates, which are in the non-services sector, which actually either create or emit or buy a lot of carbon. Automotive companies or their products create a lot of carbon. And within that, we looked at about 100, somewhere between 80 and 100 companies and their investments in the green space, so climate businesses. And we found, interestingly, that in the 4 years to 2023, and we'll see what 2024 has to say, in the 4 years, their investments went up from about $40-50 billion to about $250-300 billion. And this was about 70-80 companies, as I said. It's 6x in 4 years. 6x in 4 years. That's the climate investments that these companies made. Much of this is, of course, in industries and sectors where there are either mature technologies or mature regulations. So it's renewables, it's power grid, greener power grids, it's automotive and batteries, it's oil, e-fuels or biofuels. That's where most of the investment is. Roughly half, 40% is in power, a third is in auto, and 10-15% is in biofuels, right? So more mature technologies. There's about 10% investment also in newer technologies, either in the form of R&D or in the form of venture build-ups. So this is all from corporates, right? And of course, then there's venture capital on top of that, which is also driving innovation in this world. Now, that said, this has to continue to accelerate, and I would say 3 factors within that, right? So one is technology. Shiv talked about that. What we have found is that at every stage of technology, very early to reasonably mature stage of technology development, for every 100x scaling up of a technology, the costs go down by about 90%. So they come down to effectively 0.1% by the time 100 power 3, 10,000, 100,000 x the capacity is built out in these technologies, right? So that needs to continue to happen both through innovation of technology and through scaling, right? The second one is, of course, regulatory support. So some of these, like EVs to some extent even today, are probably still continued. I might even say the renewable growth in India is still supported by hidden subsidies of some form in the grid. So subsidies, demand mandates, bans, carbon prices, all of these measures which provide corporate the economic signals so that people like Shiv, when they make their investment decisions, these investment decisions are on a level playing field, and it's not just ITC doing the sets of things, but everybody is on the same level playing field, and the economics incentives are there. And somebody or the other is paying for the extra costs that have to be incurred. And so, these things have to happen. There's a next set of technologies which might come out. Green ammonia, green DRI are possibilities. We did see a lot of movement, and we do see a lot of movement on this, driven by regulations, because technology costs are still high. And the hope and expectation is that what Europe has done and led and shown the world will persist despite their economic difficulties and will grow.
That's interesting, actually, because in fact, so this whole argument that perhaps, because of these concerns over slowdown, inflation, geopolitical uncertainties, that will have a pullback is not true really, because you're saying that the actually investments are going up.
Yes, and the other thing, we don't know what 2024 will show, right? So there may be a bit of a pullback, that 250 to 300 billion may be down by 20% or something. I think the thing to think about is that if you take a slightly longer term trend, I gave you a 4-year trend, and if you take the next 25 years, there's only one direction this is going in, right? It will have its periods of difficulty, because nothing goes secularly. It does go secularly in one direction, in my view, but with its own ups and downs.
Okay. Shivakumar, actually, this in the current context, as we talked of in terms of the various constraints that corporates face, despite that, this climate investments to turn it as a perception of more as a threat to as an opportunity, while there are BRSR and other compulsions as well, but to see it as an opportunity and link to that. Is that you are a veteran in the agri space, you understand this space so deeply. It's supposed to be the hardest to abate sector. So can real change at scale come here is one question which seems to be bothering the intellectual engines in this arena.
Like Rajat was saying, these are all multiple questions.
I had to constraint of time. I have to pack my multiple questions.
So
Leave it to you to pick what you want to.
So the climate and abatement here, two very different sets of issues, and one won't be able to integrate the answer. But let me pick up climate to start with.
Yes.
If the it's obviously simultaneously both a threat as well as an opportunity, and in the last 3 years, if there is one item on which significant of investments we are making on in generating new knowledge in the form of mapping the forecast to implications to agriculture in different regions and building toolkits to tweak the agronomy practices on real-time basis. It's in this area when it comes to agriculture. I mean, similarly, implications are also there on physical assets like factories and hotels and all of that, and other areas. But the same core data that is available, let's say as part of IPCC, we had models built by many countries around the world, last version being CMIP 6 as they call, more than 100 models on decadal forecast until the end of the current century. Now, we are using AI startup to really locally optimize for different individual weather parameters from all of these different models to pick up what element suits the ideal forecast for 20, 30, 40, 50 and so on until the end of the century, and map them to different phenological stages of each crop. The same increase in wind speed may have a negative impact on one crop which is in a ready to harvest stage versus another crop which is still in a grain formation stage, or another tree which is in the fruit filling stage, is very different. And therefore how different phenological states are getting impacted by this weather forecast, and therefore this really informs the research on breeding, because much of the breeding research really takes as much as 20 to 25 years to fructify. And therefore, unless you have these 40, 50, 60, 20, 40, 50, 60 year forecast plugged in with whatever level of accuracy and confidence we have on these forecasts, you are not really fine-tuning your breeding to produce, rather than generally saying we have climate resilient stuff. To say in Gujarat, in some district, for this crop, what kind of breeding will be required, as opposed to something which we will do in Bengal in a very different kind of a form. And then modify your agronomy toolkits based on the short-term forecast, which comes from a separate stream. Now, this is the kind of a database knowledge, and so the effort is that all of this, in due course of time, ideally should be part of a digital public infrastructure.
Which is yet to take shape.
The idea is that when you have a proof of concept being brought to the government, you can shape that policy to say that when you do this, this is how it is benefiting. And then there is a progress which says that, I think now tell us what else can be done like this, can then become...
Because there are limits to which a corporate can do in this. There will have to be more...
Also what happens is that when you do it as a corporate, we would obviously keep it as a proprietary intellectual property.
Right.
Which is not necessarily good, and both not necessary for us to do all this, like for 10 other people to do it and reinvent.
Right, understood.
And so it's both from the perspective of can do, cannot do is one angle, because there's obviously a gain when you look at it as an opportunity, that if you are able to build climate resilience, and we do this for many other countries, comparing in different crops from around the world, to say that, okay, where is the opportunity for India 10 years hence in terms of export, not just this year's and next year's opportunity. And therefore, how do you build this capability in value addition and everything else? That's the opportunity. If Brazil is not taking on this as quickly as we can take in India, that's an opportunity that one sees. Vietnam is doing something else in some other crop, that's an opportunity. I think how do you identify these climate hotspots around the world and then take early steps to be able to do it is the opportunity that one has, where all of these are threats that we are dealing with.
So actually we know how to take it to scale really. But I think the larger issue of digital public infrastructure, all
yeah,
that
I mean,
will
we have
be-
done it
will
in
be
the
huge element.
financial sector, and I'm sure
Yeah,
there
we
is no
can do-
reason
we
why
can-
it can't
we
be
can
done.
repeat,
In agriculture, already the very first step is happening in the form of
Right.
the Agri stack, starting with farmer identity and geotagging of the land, and some of these, the agronomy layer and the climate layer, can certainly get added on top, and such other elements.
Yeah. Rajat, you, despite the positive sense that you actually gave in terms of that there is an enthusiasm and an energy to invest more in climate investments, the fact remains today that that we are headed towards a more oilier world, a deglobalized world. There are likely to be curbs, there are likely to be tariff walls. These different geographies are going to pull back on the go green journey. So in that scenario, how should corporates prepare themselves for such a world? Because that's not inevitable.
Maybe I'm going to pick up on this, and also another question that you asked in the last round around what should India do. In that context is what corporates need to be.
It will help if you can say that.
Yeah. So let me start there. I think let me be provocative here, right? I think for India, this is not a story of decarbonization. I'm just picking up on the carbon topic again within sustainability. It is not a story of decarbonization, and that's because 80% of India hasn't been built yet, or 75% of India of 2050 hasn't been built yet. The steel plants aren't there, the cement plants aren't there, the roads aren't there, the number of cars on the street aren't there, the consumption levels aren't there yet. Right?
We still need to peak.
They still need to get to be 5 times as much as it is today, right? So 5 times as much of India's factories and so on haven't been built yet. And so therefore, India can keep focusing on the 20% of carbon emissions. Our carbon emissions are roughly 3 billion tons, net carbon emissions. Left as they are, even with the efficiencies that we see, they'll get to 12, 13 billion, like China's today, right, in a 25-year time frame. And we can worry about the 1/5 of carbon emissions that we've already created the base for. In my view, we should worry more about the 80% that we haven't created yet. And that requires work. It's not like it'll happen on its own, that abatement on that 80%. Let me give you one example of that, which also illustrates why it's not about decarbonization but building India, right? So I was party to supporting the creation of the solar mission in 2010-ish time frame. And we had put a set of policies in place which then led to the costs of solar declining from 15, 16 rupees, equivalent to diesel at that point of time, to 7, 8, 9. And then China kicked in with its technology advancements, and they came down to 2 to 3 rupees relatively soon. I mean, the next 10 years after that. And then they've stayed somewhat stable since then. But it took 10 years for us to put the policy in place, to institutionalize the policy in the form of SECI, which now leads to gigawatt tenders being put out, and for tailwinds from China on the technology front and the sourcing of equipment to kick in. And for what we discussed, land companies to become also big enough to be able to buy land at that scale, to get transmission at that scale, to deliver projects that are $2, $3, $4 billion projects now, right? So it took 10 years for all of that ecosystem to get created, everything to come together. The question that we should be asking ourselves is that for capacities that are going to come in the next decade, whether it's the automotive park capacity or the steel capacity or the refining capacity that may be needed, for chemicals, for example, how can we put policies, technologies, corporates at scale in place today in the next 5, 7 years that will be able to build all of that green? Right? So to me, that is the question. It's not a question of decarbonization. By the way, I would also say that if you look around Southeast Asia, which is, in my view, over-focused on decarbonization, it has done very little of what India has done. I mean, they talk about 20 megawatt solar plants. We talk about 2 gigawatt solar plants in India, right? It's because of the foresight of whoever it was at that time, the government, that put the set of policies in place and mechanisms in place that have led to renewables being put in scale today, right? So we have to do those same sets of things. We are trying. The hydrogen mission, there's a steel mission, there's a whole bunch of pushes behind electric vehicles. But to me, that is what India should do. And when that happens, there's a bunch of opportunities that open up for corporates.
So it's not really, permit me if I hope I have got this correct. Instead of, let's say, focusing on decarbonizing the past, we're talking of decarbonizing the future, in some sense.
By the way, it's neither either or. I'm making an extreme point. It's never either or. Because, if there is energy efficiency to be had, why not?
Okay.
Right? Because it's useful, it's beneficial. But all I'm saying is that let's not over-focus on decarbonizing the past for us.
Right.
Europe has to... See, decarbonization of the past is a term coming from the West to us, right? Europe has to do it. To some extent, the US has to do it. Japan has to do it. Korea has to do it because their industrial capacities are built. Right?
Absolutely.
We are building our industrial capacity. China has to do it.
Right.
Also, I think now their industrial capacity, they have half of the world's industrial capacity.
Right.
Right? For us, the opportunity is different. And in that process, the opportunity for us is to create the industries of the future. Right? Which, by the way, China is doing.
Right.
Why should China do it? Why should we not do it? We have the experimentation ground and we have the growth ground to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sivakumar, to take off from where Rajat left this point, when this is what the journey should be, then there is always, in the Indian context, the role of regional priorities, social license to operate. How do we make this part of this sustainability endeavor, given that this is the journey to be taken?
Yeah, I think that's the narrative that needs to be driven from countries like India, that instead of looking at the metrics as it is seen from already developed economies perspective, and we have to build much larger, our per capita incomes have to go up, but obviously we won't build the way they have built in the last century. We will build it differently. That narrative has to come very clearly, whether in the matter of water or in energy and every other area in a very similar kind of fashion. And therefore, when you look at, obviously as part of a global market, one has to demonstrate the ESG scores as the West has already put in place. But in our own metrics, we shouldn't just be copying those things here, but create something which is a developing country centric or India centric, growth economy centric in a manner that we see this. Otherwise, those scores will become end in themselves. And therefore, how do you drive this narrative is very important. For India, in addition to these environment aspects, social, from the perspective of inequality, is very important. Now, when you look at social metrics largely in the West-centric view, other than, of course, in the larger SDG kind of a context, from a corporate perspective, is always that employee welfare and rights and those kinds of issues, which are obviously existing as a basic threshold level, but more important is how do you deal with inequality, but that becomes a license to operate that you're talking about. You need to deal with those issues and they don't even feature of any relevant salience. So I think that's how it has to be always from that tomorrow's perspective, because sustainability for businesses is about tomorrow, that we are talking about society for tomorrow.
Okay. Two other quick points actually. Mr. Kumar, we have discussed this point earlier as well. These days when we talk of sustainability, there is always these buzzwords and fads which come up each time, while blockchain or AI and others may not be really buzzwords, but you know the way things move. How do we as a corporate actually ensure that this is a fad and what is more foundational? How do you make decisions on this early on? Very briefly, if you could.
No, it's interesting that, Gartner, some of you would be familiar with, of the Gartner's hype curve that is used in IT world for a long time. And earlier this year, they had published a hype curve for environmental sustainability. Take several words that are used like this and then saying in terms of at different points in that curve, where are these positioned? So it's in terms of what is hype and where the future is something now becoming a well-researched kind of a topic from around the world as well. But the simplistic kind of response to your question is, when it's integrated into business, like my first response was, you see that anything which is brought in, whether it is a new technology or a new buzzword or a new score or a new legislation or any of these things, is you look at the time horizon of that and the impact horizon of that on your two axes and see that is this something which is also going to deliver an impact over a long time, or is this something which is not going to be as relevant in the long term, maybe high in the short run or vice versa. And that really then determines in terms of where do you want to focus your energies on. And something you need to start early, like water was becoming a crisis by 2015 or so. The work had to happen in 1990s. Climate is becoming a challenge now, and therefore work had to start about 5-7 years ago. Therefore, picking up those early signals to be able to see across all of this, both on time and impact, is the basic grid to assess in terms of what is buzz and where is the merit.
Yeah. Last point, I think when we conclude, Rajat, I was asking Mr. Sivakumar earlier if they had any one question that you had for Rajat, and he mentioned this point that you would like to know your thoughts on how to achieve a common ground between developing and developed countries about CBDR, RC. You have any thought on that? When we conclude with that, you get the last word.
Look, I don't know how to achieve a common ground. We've seen what happened in COP and how common that ground was. I think for a country like India, it's in my view, we should be self-reliant, and we should do what we need to do for our country, because there's a very significant value creation opportunity in building India right at a societal level and as well as a national level. It does have its challenges, because many of the technologies that we are talking about which decarbonize are technologies which are more capital intensive. There's less OPEX, more CAPEX in these technologies, like renewables, for example, right? You put the plant, there's no OPEX after that. The plant is, CAPEX is largely the only thing. So we will have our challenges on how to fund some of these things. We will have some of these technologies will end up costing more, so there will be inflationary challenges, but in the end we have to find our own solutions.
Yeah, that may be the only way to perhaps conclude this, because I think that's an enduring journey, and I'm keeping on seeing this time's up kind of thing. So thanks so much for your time, really very nice. Hope you have had some takeaways.